Afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
Broadcasting live from our Sanctum Sanctorum in Venice, California. I'm Krista.
I'm Kristen.
And we are the Sixth Sense Society. Welcome back to another episode of the Sixth Sense Society. Tonight we are going to be talking about one of our favorite books, Magick in Theory and Practice by the great Aleister Crowley. And so before we get started, however, Michael has a few things to say, announcements, and a couple of things about our episode, our adventures last night. Sorry.
We had a really good time last night. We were over at David Ullman's, our friend who has the haunted house up in the Hollywood Hills where the Manson family did and Sharon Tate, all those folks. And it was a fantastic evening. We had a really good time. Lots of really cool people there doing ghost hunting. But this really funny thing happened. He was having a seance in the bottom room. And so a friend of ours was there, and she was talking about her sister, trying to connect with her sister who had passed over. And so the medium, did her shtick. And after she left the room, they had a little keyboard, a piano-like keyboard that was sort of a kid's toy. It looked like a, My Little Pony kind of thing, very pink and childlike, And I guess they thought the ghost could manipulate that somehow to make sound. And so after the medium left, I went up to my friend and said, wouldn't that be that'd be a great thing? Maybe we could channel Liberace. And she got really spooky and looked at me. She said my sister actually was engaged to Liberace, and she actually showed me showed us all the pictures that were from back in the day where they were actually on the cover of TV Guide or something where they were actually engaged to each other. And so what a cool synchronicity. And then they'd had these EVP meters and stuff on the table, and no sooner did we talk about Liberace, and they'd been doing nothing all night when suddenly all started to go crazy and light up and everything else. So I think that we channeled the spirit of Liberace at David's place last night. So it was pretty funny. So it really livened the place up. So we had a really good time with that. But we thank David, and he's going to do more events in the future, and you can find out that information on our website too. And if you get to go to his ghost hunts, it's always a heck of a good time up in the hills. So we encourage that. A couple of other announcements just for their show, and then we'll get started. We just passed 1,000 downloads on our podcast, so thank you to all you guys that are listening on Spotify and iTunes and whatnot. That makes us happy. And we are about 6 people away from our 200th subscriber. So if any of you are listening that haven't subscribed, you can be number 200. We should have like a giveaway or something for number 200. But
Prove it.
Yeah, exactly. But we would appreciate it, and that would be really great. And we're getting a lot of new subscribers, and we're super happy about that too. And some great comments, and we love it. So if you guys have a comment on our show, love to hear it, and it's always a really good thing. Just a quick look at next week. We are going to have our good friend Reverend Jim McGrath back on the show again. And he's going to talk about evangelicalism and the rise of fundamentalism, in particular with Christianity, and how that kind of, was born and moved away from the real gospels and so forth. And so we're going to have a hard look at fundamentalism, which is, I think in our day and age, a very important thing to look at. It's been a big factor in our society for sure. So I think that that's going to be really interesting, and we have a bunch of other great shows come up. So don't want to spend all night on it, so go to our website, sixthsensesociety.com. And you can find all the information on upcoming shows and everything else that's going on with us. And we're happy to send you there for info. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to you guys, and we're going to get into Aleister Crowley and Magick in Theory and Practice.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. So let's just get aside a couple of facts about the book itself. First of all, it's part 3 of Crowley's magnus opus, Magick with a K, which he is the one that differentiated the word magic, like stage magic, which is MAGIC, and added a K so you can see the difference. And no, it's not stage magic he's talking about. So the book evidently was created because of questions that his principal students ask over a certain period of time. And the principal collaborators, I can't talk tonight for some reason, were actually, a lot of them were women. And they were given credit for their collaboration, which I didn't know. This was something new I discovered. And one was Sora Viracam, Leela Waddell, and Sora Rodon. Those were the three. And then he gave also some co-authorship credit. So I don't quite understand the difference, but he differentiated, and it was dedicated to Rose Crowley and to Frata per Ardua and Leah Hersig and Gerald York. I used some of their fraternity names and some of them just the regular names there because I couldn't pronounce some of them. So it was, that's how it came to be. It was originally published in 1929, but what was interesting about the collection of the 4 books, which is a bigger volume which has 3 other parts, and it was actually not published, the first edition, until 1994. And by the way, if you want to read this particular book, and I think many of Crowley's books are free online. I could not believe how many places you can find the PDF, the full book. It tells you what edition it is if you don't have the money. I don't know if you remember this, Michael, but when I worked at the Buddy Tree bookstore, there was a section for Aleister Crowley in the back where the office was, and it was all, you couldn't reach it. You had to get the staff to help you because Crowley's fans all thought his work should be free. And so now some of them are, so they got their wishes. So I thought that was kind of funny. So that, and then one other thing I wanted to say about just the way Magick in theory and practice is arranged. It's arranged in basically, there are 4 parts. The first, not Magick in theory and practice, but the Magick itself has 4 parts. So it has a part 1 is mysticism, part 2 is Magick elementary theory, part 3 is what we're talking about tonight, Magick in theory and practice, which, by the way, you can definitely read on its own. And part 4 is the Book of the Law. And all of the books that he has written, at least these 2, have a lot of good stuff in the appendices. So you definitely want to check out the appendices. And by the way, his footnotes sometimes are really funny. So you should check that out. So maybe I'll start just with a little bit about the introduction, and then we'll kick it over to Kristen and Michael. And the reason I wanted, first of all, if that's the only thing you read in the book, you will get so much information about his intention, about magical theory, definitions of magic, which some are very famous. You'll have a lot of food for thought. And one of the things that I really noticed this time, because I've read this more than once, and it's one of those books that you really can reread and something will strike you differently according to where you're at with your own practices in life. And he said he wrote this for everybody. And the quote he said was, it's funny because he said, "Magic is for everyone. I've written this book to help the bankers, the pugilist, the biologist, the poet, the Navy, the grocer, the factory girl, the mathematician, the stenographer, the golfer, etc., so that to fulfill themselves perfectly, each in his, her, or her own function." So why I think it is really important, Aleister Crowley's work, you really get a sense of what he's trying to accomplish is way bigger than following the path of ceremonial magic. And you get it, the more you read different books by him, you really see how he's been misrepresented on so many levels. So I wanted to just start with that idea, like the introduction, and then I have some more, but let's kick it over to you and see what some of your thoughts are about the book.
Well, the way that Aleister Crowley has this great definition of magic, and he says magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. And what's interesting when you read a lot about this book is that he constantly talks about science as magic as science and science as magic. And what I think is really awesome about that is you kind of break it down in these sort of these steps that are almost very practical. So when I was reading it, I kept thinking about Practical Magic, the name of that movie, but it's very similar in the sense where there's these very specific steps about being. It's the structure in which you create, and you use your environment around you to will something. So I think he's a very interesting dude.
Yes, and he's older when he writes this book, and what he says in the introduction too is that now this is really telling about how some modern Crowley students view Crowley. It's completely wrong, because he said at the time when he was still alive, "My former work has been misunderstood and its scope limited by my use of technical terms, it has attracted only too many dilettanti and eccentrics, weaklings seeking in magic an escape from reality. I myself was first consciously drawn to the subject in this way, and it has basically repelled only too many scientific and practical minds, such as I most designed to influence. So ironically, you see, and again, I'm not saying this about all of them, but I remember when I first came to LA, some of the ones I met really seemed to be trying to imitate Crowley's life. And it
Well, who
wasn't
wouldn't
like
want to? I mean, it's sort of, you know what I mean?
and
You know,
and they
he had a lot of fun.
he did, and the idea that he's trying to draw the serious person that is practical and, like you were saying, scientific. I
Right.
thought that was cool.
Another thing that he says that I think is really key, and it's very often what we talk about here on this channel, is every intentional act is a magical act. So it's about intention, right? It's about the intention of when you strike a match and light a candle. What's the intention behind it? It's not so much about the ritual per se, although Crowley did have elaborate ritual to the point where it was like theater. My friend, Dr. Ed Ligon, who practically did a PhD, you know, on Aleister Crowley and a theater of the occult. I mean, they were very elaborate, and it's so entertaining. But at the same time, I think the heart of Crowley is very much about you can do magic in the words that you say to someone on a
Right.
daily basis, in the way you pass a cup of tea to someone. There can be magic in that. You know, I think, which I think is important, because I think when you think of Aleister Crowley, you think of, I don't know, these sort of really elaborate, esoteric, eccentric, quirky, kind of very sexual things. And I think he was all of that, but he was so much more. And he was a man living on Earth, having to survive in a grounded way, not just an esoteric spirit way.
There's also, I think, really interestingly, when you look at Crowley, of course, he was very into a lot of the yoga and a lot of the Eastern stuff. And I think that that really is an influence. You see that in a lot of his teachings. And the thing I look at when I look at his work on magic, and again, just sort of pulling up some quotes here, he says, one must find out for oneself and make sure beyond doubt who one is, what one is, why one is. Being thus conscious of the proper course to pursue, the next thing is to understand the conditions necessary to follow it out. After that, one must eliminate from oneself every element alien or hostile to success and develop those parts of oneself which are specifically needed to control the aforesaid conditions. And so much of what he's talking about is kind of mindfulness, just the idea of, rather than just being reactionary and random and just, you know, that I'm actually sort of trying to actually sit down and be thoughtful about, you know, how I'm approaching life. And if this is what I want, am I going about it the right way? And then the other thing that I really like about Crowley and is that he doesn't sort of separate the magical world from everyday life and the material
Right.
world. And because I think I see so many people that they do spells and they do prayers and they do all these things, but then they never fill out a job application. And you know, and he believes that you're supposed to work on every level, the physical level as well as the spiritual level. And so it's not just a one-dimensional thing with him. And I really appreciate that. Sorry, back to you guys.
Well, you know, if you read, I just read an excerpt from his diaries, and you know, the magical diary is a hugely important thing for magicians, which I actually learned from someone years ago. But it's so meticulous. You actually stop at different times and write the time and what was going on. And I wouldn't even have time to do it on a regular basis. I could maybe do it for a month, because and
Right.
some of it's, you know, is so that you can basically be observing if anything is having an effect, and if you want to remember if you did it, if it had an effect. I was really impressed by that, and how he used, like Michael said, the breath work a lot, the yoga, and he was in his diary very honest and really funny at times. It's the thing about that cracks me up. The more you really read every little thing about Crowley, there's always little funny moments in there where he's like very insulting to people that normally you'd think would be his allies.
Right.
It's not.
Right,
you
right.
know,
Well, I
so.
think he was a person of the people. In many ways, you know, he says here, and I love this quote: "Every man and every woman is a star." That is to say, every human being is intrinsically an independent individual with his own proper character and proper motion. And I think regardless of whether he liked you or not, there was a certain amount of respect if you could be yourself. I think he probably, I don't know Aleister Crowley and I don't know his work and his life as well as you guys, but from what I can see from all the research I've done is that he would, he may not, he may not be someone that you'd want to have lunch with, or he may not want to have lunch with you, but if you were doing your own thing, yeah, he'd leave you alone. He'd respect it, because I think he respected that more than he respected the pseudo intellectual, or the pseudo magician, or the person who was trying to get in with him to kind of be with around him and his lifestyle to sort of feed off him. And he probably did have a lot of people that seemed to be allies who were really sort of trying to feed off him. And he probably, um, knowing Crowley, kind of let them think that they were getting to him, and then sort of in some way let them know, yeah, you're not the real deal, you know.
Well, the thing I always enjoy when I read Crowley, I have such a different path spiritually, and I'm happy with it. I'm more like Lady Frida Harris in terms of I've not done many drugs. I was kind of very pure on some level initially. I was so pure in Tibetan Buddhism when I took my vows, and I finally got over that part. But I really deeply love him, and I really appreciate what he's given to us. And the more I read him, the more excited I get. And it's like all of the bad stuff about Crowley is out there. So what you find is some of the better stuff, and it's quite surprising that once you really, dig into his book, and don't be intimidated by the terms if you know nothing about the ceremonial magic and the terms. I did not, and you'll learn and you'll get the stuff. And there's a lot of good things without knowing. And he wrote this to be less technical, he said. I also wanted to mention too, like in that introductory part, there's 28 theorems he puts forth about magic.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to probably pick all of my ones they're all
Yeah.
great, but what you notice is you're drawn to certain ones at certain times. So
Yeah.
the first one I was drawn to was the 15th, and I've been thinking about this concept for a long time. He said every force in the universe is capable of being transformed into another kind of force by using any other kind of force, by using suitable means. There is thus an inexhaustible supply of any particular kind of force that we need. I've been thinking a lot how we need energy for things.
Right. We're made of energy.
Right.
So we have to have
how
it.
that's like a really profound thought. So, but then you have to think, well, how do I harness these forces? And
Right.
magic is supposedly to help us harness these forces in a way that we can accomplish our will. And will in Crowley's world is capital W. It's not the little will, which is a big important difference. You're not supposed to just go around doing everything you want. That's not what he meant by it anyway.
Right. Although maybe some people might think by looking at his life he did, but that was obviously if they're not looking deep enough.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because Crowley, of course, really does get that rap for being dark and evil and so forth, and most people believe that. But when you really look at his work, he really renounces a lot of that stuff. And there's one quote in the book where he says, "Acts which are essentially dishonorable must not be done. They would be justified only by calm contemplation of their correctness in abstract cases." So he's basically saying, look, we're not here to do harm, to do evil, and so forth. There may be those rare situations where someone just needs a good smack. But for the most part, we're not supposed to do dishonorable things. And so I think that that's really fascinating. And of course, the chapter that most people freak out is the bloody sacrifice one, where,
Yes,
where
which
it's
I
all
have
about
right here.
sacrificing the human baby and all. But what's
Yeah.
really interesting about that is that he's actually using it as a metaphor. He's not using it literally. And there's a big warning about that, in the book, which he says basically at the very last sentence in that chapter, he says, "You're also likely to get into trouble over this chapter unless you truly comprehend its meaning." And it's basically what he's doing is using the whole thing as a metaphor for sex. And in the male child being the sperm and the bloody sacrifice, the woman's period. And what he's basically saying in Victorian England, if I publish a book on sex, you guys won't publish it, but I can use this as a metaphor, and you're just fine with that. And so he's kind of poking fun, I think, at the English society. He seemed to like to stick them in the eye a lot. And just to reinforce that, then in the footnote that follows, he says, "There is a traditional saying that whenever an adept seems to have made a straightforward, comprehensible statement, then it most certainly that he means something entirely different. The truth is nevertheless clearly set forth in his words. It is his simplicity that baffles the unworthy. I have chosen the expression in this chapter in such a way that it is likely to mislead those magicians who allow selfish interest to cloud their intelligence, but to give useful hints to such as are bound by the proper oaths to devote their powers to legitimate ends. And so again, that it's hard for me to read those words and think, here's a guy that is the personification of evil. He's talking about, pretty honorable stuff at the end of the day. Now, it's a bit of a dangerous game, and I don't know if I would have played it, but because there are people that did take it very literally and did get into trouble, and then he kind of got, accused of egging them on, so it became a thing. And as I said, maybe a bit of a dangerous game, but I certainly don't think he was evil, and I don't think that was ever his intent.
Well, I think during that time you could be put in prison for writing about sexual things. Wasn't
Well,
Oscar
it was the
Wilde?
whole, and it was the whole Marat Sat, like with, you know, how he was just put in an insane asylum his whole life, and he would sneak everything out. Um, yeah, so you could be put in jail, you could be put in an insane asylum, which back then you did
Oh.
not want to be in an insane asylum. Like the Marquis de Sade, who, of course, kind of held reign in his insane asylum.
Yeah.
But that's a whole different story. A whole other show, actually, on the Marquis de
Yeah,
Sade.
that would be a good show.
But yeah, absolutely, very interesting, and it's interesting. Yet it should be forgotten that this and other art at which we have dared darkly to hint are the supreme formula for practical magic. So it's interesting, but and that comes from that chapter as well about human sacrifice. That is the last paragraph. So yeah.
Another one that I liked, and again, this is kind of where I'm at right now in my own consciousness, was the 20th forum. It says, man can only attract and employ the forces for which he is really fitted. Now, this to me really strikes at the notion that you can have everything you want and be everything you want. That is absolutely, we all know that's not true. We all know that we have certain limits and conditions from all kinds of things that are actually healthy. Otherwise, we'd probably not get anything done if we could be everything and do everything.
Right.
So this is interesting to me. Like, maybe if you're doing magic, maybe what you're asking for is not really fitted to who your true self is. This is why it fails, and you keep trying and trying, because one of the things Michael mentioned, I think Kristen in her own way said too, is that magic is really initially about really discovering your true nature and will, and then from there, you find out what to do with it. And most of us struggle with even that first step of, who am I really, in terms of what is my true connection to my higher self, to the better part of me, whatever that is. And I think that that's so profound, and he goes over sort of ways to work with that. And that's the thing that he's trying to emphasize in general for this aeon, is that we discover who we really are, and magic can help us to do that and maintain it, so we can live a true and genuine, like you said, authentic life,
Absolutely.
So I like that 20th forum.
The other thing that I like with Crowley and Magic and Theory and Practice, of course, because we practice it, is his thoughts on divination. And he has some really interesting things to say about that. And it's so interesting because it's kind of stuff that I don't know if I remember because I read this and it influenced me, or whether we just agreed, but it's definitely something the way I look at it too. And because, of course, we all practice some form of divination, tarot, and so forth. But he said, divination is no more than a rough and ready practical method which we understand hardly at all and operate only as empirics. Success for the best diviner alive is no more certain in any particular instance than a long putt in a champion golfer. Its calculations are infinitely more complex than chess, a chess played on an infinite board with men whose moves are indeterminate and made still more difficult by the interference of imponderable forces and unformulated laws, while its conduct demands not only the virtues themselves rare enough of intellectual and moral integrity, but intuition combining delicacy with strength in such perfection and to such extremes as to make its existence appear monstrous and miraculous against nature. Now clearly he liked to be dramatic, so there's no doubt about that. And then he said, to admit this is not to discredit oracles. On the contrary, the oracles fell into disrepute just because they pretend to do more than they could. To divine concerning a matter is little more than to calculate probabilities. And I've said over and over to people during readings that our job is to help you calculate probability. Is this something that's likely to occur, unlikely to occur, how likely to occur? Can you do something to increase the likelihood of it occurring? And it just goes to show where he was coming from. And the guy is such an intelligent guy, and he really gets to the heart of things. And I do think that he didn't BS. He didn't really want to exaggerate, so he really wasn't trying to do that. He definitely spoke in riddles and metaphors sometimes. He definitely was theatrical, as you said, a little over the top on occasion and very theatrical, but not exaggeration. And he really didn't like people that exaggerated or were hypocrites or BSers. And so I think that comes across a lot in his writings as well.
Yeah, and I wanted to add that whole idea that the oracle is promising too much. I really can relate to that because when I used to work at the Bodhi Tree and I would look at the resumes of people wanting to work there, the things they claimed they can do, I mean, it was over the top, and it was crazy. You could tell, and it wasn't just one person; it was a lot of people. Now that could be different now because that was almost a long time ago. But that there is only so much we can really do, even with divination and oracles. But he believed in doing it, actually, though.
It's interesting, but the more I read these theorems, the more it seems to me, I know this is going to sound strange, but like a twisted self-help book from back then. Because like when you read things like number 24, which every man has an indefensible right to be what he is, a lot of these theorems to me are telling you to be yourself and that you can command your own destiny. You can make your own choices. And what you can do, the practical steps that you can take. What you were saying before, it wasn't about just lighting a candle. It's about filling out a resume. I mean, it's that whole big thing about, with The Secret and they say, sit and stare at a $100 bill and then envision yourself as a millionaire. And you can do that, and that can definitely be part of it. But if you don't make up a business plan or go get a job or do some sort, you can't just lie and look at a $100 bill and know that it's going to be $1 million. So I think in his own way, Crowley was saying back then, these are the things that we can do practically, that magic is practical. And he does talk about nature a lot as well, about being able to command nature, which I think he's trying to say is you can control your own environment. If something's not working for you, leave. That can be magic. Leaving a job that's horrible, that's dragging you down, and having the courage to leave it, and regardless of the financial situation, that's very magical, I think, for some people, to do that, because it's very difficult to leave situations or to change your life.
Well, I think that comes back to, again, mindfulness again, the idea that I'm not going to live in denial. This isn't the right situation for me, and I'm going to extract myself from it, and being more deliberate, more thoughtful in how you approach your life. And that's such a big, big part of his teachings on magic, is that, and there is this huge universe out there, this huge world of possibilities, and I think he really saw that. And then I think to your point, Kristen, also, is clearly Crowley was never concerned with fitting in.
Yes.
If anyone in the world was an individual, it was Crowley. And so I think the idea of him embracing individualism, I think he strongly believed that you have to be yourself and to be something you're not. He hated hypocrites. And I think growing up again in a strict religious household and seeing the debauchery that we were just talking about, some of the things where certain pro-family values politicians have gotten in trouble for having lewd sex in the bushes, type of thing. And so again, the idea of hypocrisy, I think, really bothered him. And I think that growing up in that Victorian time where in society everybody was supposed to be proper and gentlemanly and ladylike, and then in private they were doing all these debauched things, I think just said, why don't you just do it openly? He would say, just be yourself. Don't be ashamed, And so I do think that was a big part of it. But as I said, Crowley, never a big fan of trying to fit in to make other people happy, that's for sure.
Well, he was Leo rising with Uranus and Leo in the first house, which, of course, Uranus is all about freedom and eccentricity. Leo is about the ego, and that's not a good placement for Uranus, but it still would fit with his shocking
the first house
nature.
Is who am I? I am, eccentric. And proud of it.
Right.
You know.
There's a great
And I will
battle
shock
between
you.
Yeats and Crowley, evidently. They got in a huge battle. So that would have been, I'd like to go back and see that, actually. The last one that I liked in the theorem part was 26, and he says every man has a right, the right of self-preservation to fulfill himself to the utmost. But why I like it is the footnote, because people claim that he encourages anything to happen. Do whatever you will. It doesn't matter. You could be a murderer. And that's not at all what he's saying. In fact, he says men of criminal nature are simply at an issue with their true will. The murderer actually has a will to live, and his will to murder is a false will at variance with his true will, since he risks death at the hands of society by obeying his criminal impulse. I liked how it's logical, not emotional. He says this is going against his own will to live because he's going to be caught and sometimes executed. So he's not saying, and also that idea that he differentiates between the little will, our selfish side, and the bigger will, the true will of ourself. What does that mean? And to me, that's connected to, again, the destiny and authenticity and the middle pillar in the Kabbalah. So I think, whenever people start, he's evil, he encourages, honestly, it's just not backed up in his books.
Well, and my last one is number 27. Every man should make magic the keystone of his life. He should learn its laws and live by them. And so he's not saying, let's just do magic, harem, scarum to get whatever we want. And that's, we all know that he did have his, for lack of a better word, his own society, his own kind of like place where he lived his life his own way with his own followers, and he did his own thing in his own private way. That way, he definitely lived his own life. But he is encouraging you to understand the laws of nature, to understand the laws of magic. And if you are going to practice magic, if you are going to will your life, to follow the practical laws of it. So again, it kind of goes back to a lot of what we talk about here on the channel, I feel, where it's sort of, do you want to light a candle to break somebody up? Now, I'm not saying whether Aleister Crowley would have done that or not, but it reminds me, I kind of like to bring it into, I don't know, what we can identify with in the current modern. And, people are doing magic for stuff like that. I want to get them to call me. I want to get them to break up so they'll come back to me. I want my boss to like get sick so I can take a spot. It's that kind of stuff that we see a lot, what we call the more negative side of magic. And it's interesting how Aleister Crowley, who everyone kind of calls like the dark magician, is actually saying to understand the laws of it. Now, I'm sure it goes deeper than that, but that's what resonates with me when I read that.
Yeah, I really like that one as well, too. And, the thing about Crowley, somebody once said who practices magic, and he was broke at the end of his life. He ran out of money, and he died almost, kind of destitute with hardly anyone at his funeral. So when she heard that, she says, well, why did that happen? He does magic. Why didn't he do something to change his fortune? Well, some of the people during that time, their goals with magic were really more enlightenment. It was more conversation with the holy guardian angel. And he definitely fulfilled one of his mottos, which is to endure. He has only now really coming into his own, I think, with people like me, that I don't really have an interest in doing ceremonial magic. I'm interested in magic as a concept, philosophy, a way of life. Right. I want to test it. He's really coming into more people understanding what these deeper tones of his work are. Right. And that's what I think. And I think he had a different goal with magic and again, it's not because he's a better person or not. That was his own soul's goal.
Right. It didn't break down to, I want to live in a mansion. Right. You know what I mean? Which is in our modern society so often what people kind of like want. They want a certain type of abundance based on societal, structure of what most people in society thinks is success. And that's not what Aleister Crowley didn't care what most of society thought. He had his own goals.
I think his ritual too, and he was obviously into ritual magic, so everything, like you said, was very ceremonial and very disciplined and very ritual-like. But again, I think a lot of that also comes from that Eastern philosophy, the yoga philosophy, and the idea that it was being disciplined. It was about sort of a way of focusing the mind. Mm-hmm. And I know that as readers, we were just talking about this last night at David's, because somebody was saying, why don't you just do a reading for me? And the person said, well, I've got my way of doing things. And we have that too. And to us, again, I think the rituals that we go through, whether it's cutting a deck so many times when you deal it, or whether it's spinning around 3 times left and then doing the reading or choosing with a certain hand, it's not so much it has to be that way, but I think ritual is a great way of focusing the mind. And I think that was a big part of it, again, is creating mindfulness. And you read so many of his quotes in the book that seem to come back to the idea of be aware, be mindful of who you are, be mindful of what you want. Don't just be reactionary. Don't just be daydreaming through life, and seeing everything you do as a ritual. You look at it and you decide, is this the right way to pursue it? It was all very thought out, and I think it's all about self-awareness, if you ask me, to a great degree.
Now, there were some parts of the book I really liked because there are things, again, topics I'm researching on my own. And one was about clairvoyance. And I find the word is sort of thrown around, and I'm not sure everyone agrees with what clairvoyance is. So again, this is his opinion, but I value his opinion. And the chapter is called of Clairvoyance in the Body of Light, its power and its development. And it's one before divination. So basically, from what I understand from reading that chapter, is that clairvoyance comes from you having control or being able to use your astral double, and it can travel then using symbols to places. Because one of the things that Casey could do as a true clairvoyant, he literally could see inside the body. And I have not met many clairvoyants that have that kind of clarity. You evidently can develop it, though. That's the other thing. So don't let people say you weren't born with the gift. I'm really tired of the word "the gift." Please, let's just stop with it. Because it's an ego thing most of the time. I'm gifted. You can really, and the clairvoyant that he's describing is really useful, and it's actually very important for magicians to actually develop it. So he talks about what it is, this fine body of light, and then he talks about a method of developing it, which is really kind of cool. The slow method, which he said is kind of passive, is through gazing on like ink in your hand or that kind of. And again, if you do tarot card readings, I always advise people to actually gaze at the cards, because it does put you in a light trance. And even if you know the cards inside and out, you want to gaze at the colors and see how the effect of it is on your subconscious. So anyway, I think that, Steiner, I think, was a true clairvoyant. Casey, I think Crowley was too. So you develop this astral body, and it can travel again, using symbols. And he also talks about when you travel the astral realm. A lot of Kabbalistic people do this. They go raise on the planes, I think it's called. They're raising themselves onto the different planes. You can be tested to see if the plane is what you think it is, if I'm really in the plane of Tiferet, because there's symbols there. So, and you should tell them what symbols you see, and you'll be able to test if you're really at this place or not, and they will test you. And so that brought me to thinking about the tarot cards and how the ancient symbols that are used in the tarot cards are very specific to produce results and to open you up. So when you see modern tarot decks that have no connection to the symbols, they've lost the real connection to the tarot. And that's why it's so important to not just reinvent it and call it tarot, is that because there's a reason why there's a wand in the magician card, things like that. And there's a reason why people are pictured a certain way, because they're a symbol. The queen is a symbol. It's not a person. And so people get all offended because, there's not, different races. And I said, these are symbols of something. I never grew up in England. I can't relate personally to queens and kings. But I love the symbol of it. You know, so the idea of developing clairvoyance, using it to then travel to places. There's one other thing I wanted to say about, coming back too is really important. So he thinks that because people don't come back properly, you can get in big trouble with all kinds of things. Your health, he said, if you fail to come back properly, your body of light may wander away uncontrolled and be attacked and obsessed. You will become aware of this through the occurrence of headaches, bad dreams, or even more serious signs such as hysteria, fainting fits, possibly madness or paralysis. Even the worst of these attacks will probably wear off, but they may damage you. So I thought that was really fascinating, that, the idea you're not really grounded back into the body. You actually have to make sure you do that every time you travel.
Well, that's extremely important, because there are so many people, when you're experimenting with anything esoteric, spiritual, psychic, that they just don't seem to come back. They don't seem to be grounded in reality. And that's when you kind of get people that kind of seem a little, a little bit, that they're not here. And it's amazing to be able to travel astrally, to be able to explore, but you have to live on Earth.
Yeah.
You do have to be grounded here. It's okay to be able to have one hand in, one hand out, as above, so below. But if you do want to be successful here on Earth on any capacity, even just live, you do need to be able to ground yourself. And so, I would be very interested if Crowley has suggestions on how to do that.
I think he did have a suggestion. I can't remember if I wrote it down though. I don't remember what he said. I know you have to imagine. So one of the exercises he had was a little long, so I didn't want to say it. But
Right.
if you want to start learning to separate the astral body, you first imagine your own body in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it feels like it's an imagination, you believe that this is real. This is
Right.
so it's like stepping outside of yourself, the astral body. Then you imagine it rising and you see, and then you're supposed to look around the room.
Right.
So I'm getting to the answer to your question. Look around the room and see and describe it, but using the other body. And even if you know the room, you're still supposed to imagine that this is happening. And then you're supposed to try to rise and feel and see the room from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how you start. And so when you come back in, you imagine the body coming back into you. I know that's part of it. I think there's some other things. And also he did recommend practicing in consecrated circles.
Okay.
That you do so that you and then you
come back to that specific place.
Right, you come back and you imagine it kind of going back into the body. So that was one of the ways I remember him saying, how
I think it's really practical to have these kind of, whether you use Crowley's method or you come up with some other something else or your own thing. How do you come back from any experience like that? I know with doing plant medicine, you have to be able to be in a grounded place. And that's why when you do a consecrated circle, which I think is actually a fantastic suggestion, it's this: when you go into the circle, you call in the protection. So as you begin to go on your journey, regardless of how you're doing it, you're protected on that journey so that you can come back, and you're protected in that process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that and I think I've probably made some mistakes it's easy enough to do that. It sounds like you have a little bit of a soul loss, little parts of you get fragmented off.
Right.
And then he also talks about testing the spirits, and that one of the tests is, again, looking at the symbols and if they match, I guess. He doesn't totally explain it. I'm sure he explains it elsewhere, but he said that, this is kind of funny, every spirit up to God himself is ready to deceive you if possible, to make himself out more important than he is. In short, to lay in wait for you in 333 separate ways. It's like, and that's when one of my complaints is like, I'm talking to the spirit named, Joe. And I'm like, did you test out if Joe is really what Joe says he is? And does he really, just because someone is outside, they're not incarnated, it doesn't make them wiser. Everyone thinks that automatically they see more.
Right.
But they may brag about it or make themselves look more important.
It reminds me a little bit about what we were talking about with the fabulous Jim McGrath, who's going to be back next week, when we were talking about angels and demons. And we were kind of saying, well, everyone seems to be talking to the Archangel Michael these days.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that they're not, but I wonder, is it, and I'm sure some people absolutely are, but how do you know it's the Archangel Michael? Maybe it's another angel. Maybe it's a different spirit. Maybe it's one of your ancestors. Maybe you just love the idea of that it's Archangel Michael so much because you read it somewhere or somebody else was doing it, that you kind of went into your intuition and you started channeling these messages. And the messages are absolutely real, but you're like, oh, it's Archangel Michael. And you haven't really tested that theory.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting to have a way to test, to know what it is, because it's not about the label of where you're getting the channel or the messages or where you're going. It's about it being an honest and integrity and being able to get helpful information to yourself or to whoever it is you're trying to help, regardless of who it is.
Yeah, I've always, I still don't get a clear answer from how to test them, other than you should test them. And I've actually done some research on it. I know in Christianity they test it by asking them if they believe in Jesus Christ as Savior, and some other things where you test them the word and have them say their name. You're supposed to ask them their names too. But I don't know if that could also be a deception as well. I've yet to find something definitive that works for everything. But I know that, like, at least looking at the symbols associated with, you can tell what realm you're in, if
Right.
you're really in the realm, because it's consistent. And that's what why Kabbalah is so powerful, is that each of the planes are like Earth. They have literally the same things on it, so we can all be travelers on the astral plane and go to the same places and know we've actually been there.
Right.
But the clairvoyance thing, so you really are. It kind of seems like a form of remote viewing,
Yes.
in that you're sending your astral body, which sees differently. I guess it can see things differently, to different places. Like in consciousness, it's like the symbol, but I suppose you could also see it, because Casey could see inside the body, like literally.
Right.
So I don't know of that many people I've personally met that have that ability, that call themselves clairvoyant, but I think they're
Right.
psychic. So I think
Right.
I think there's different connotations with the word clairvoyance based on the emphasis in the late 1800s on books. Even though there's other psychic abilities, clairvoyance seems like it has some other things you're supposed to do with it too. Like in this case,
Right.
it's going to help you magically creating this being able to astral travel. So if you want to go up the tree of life, you can do it more readily. So I found that interesting, because you don't find, even though clairaudience is really interesting, he does mention clairaudience in his book too, as hearing things, but why is clairvoyance so like specific and important in many of the old occult books?
And even today, people use the word clairvoyant more than anything else, more than clairaudient or transcendent or anything else. And I think it's just trendy. And it's because clairvoyant was just a word that was used a lot from back then up until then. I don't even think that half the people that are clairvoyant even know what clairvoyance is. You know what I mean? They just have an idea of being psychic or intuitive.
Yeah.
So I think it is important to define it and to have an idea of it.
Well, and also, if we are going to eventually really want to prove things more scientifically with the psychic abilities, I would like to have clearer definitions from that point of view. Like,
Right.
I'm not saying these people are wrong or bad. I'm just saying that
Right.
it's curious why, like, a lot of the late 1800s, early 1900s, they have a lot of information and some more esoteric view of clairvoyance. And then, just like you said, it's kind of trendy, because when I was young, everybody just called themselves psychics.
Right.
I don't even remember anyone using that word.
Right.
They were psychics, and people, oh my God, she's psychic,
Right.
and that was the word for what, you're right. A lot of
Right.
people use clairvoyant now and
Yeah.
substitute.
Yeah. And it's a great, I'm a medium, but a medium of what? You know what I mean? The word channel is popular now as well. And I mean, it's nothing wrong with using any of it. And if it means something specific to you and you're specific, then that's fine. But it's just so often people just kind of label these things,
Mhm.
and they're, and I think a lot of it is about tuning into your intuition.
Mm-hmm.
And people are, as they begin to do that, they like to put a fancy name on it. And especially if they're trying to market it and sell it, they love to put a fancy name on it.
Well,
So,
I remember, I believe it's in one of Alice Bailey's books, that intuition, according to her, is the greatest form because it's connected directly to God. Psychicism in general is the astral plane. And even Crowley talks about when, in divination, when you see symbols on the astral plane, 3 different clairvoyants would say, I see this symbol, and they see something that's similar but different. And then it's all about how you interpret the symbols on the astral plane. And that's where, that is more, I think, connected to wisdom and experience. And for instance, I read for a woman, I think I told this story before, who a psychic had said when she was 20, she would drop dead at a certain age. She waited till she passed that age and she didn't drop dead, but she retired from a very long career. And she only told me afterwards, because then I think I told that story before. And so she saw this symbol probably that had a death connotation. And she interpreted the psychic as she's literally dying because she was older. She could have. So it gets really tricky, the astral plane, when it comes to, interpreting the symbols and what do they mean. And again, it's not that you shouldn't, but just remember that in general, the astral plane is seen as lower, and intuition is a direct connection to God. Intuition's almost never wrong. In fact, I can say it's not wrong, but it doesn't always tell you why, and you may misinterpret the motive.
and the thing that's wonderful about intuition is that everybody has it. Everybody has intuition. Everyone's using their intuition every single day, and some people are tapped more into it than other people. But I love that because it takes away from the whole idea of the gift that you were talking about. Oh, I've got this gift. And granted, some people are born with certain abilities and or seeing certain things from a young age, but every single person has intuition and can develop their intuition.
Hmm.
It's interesting. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who of course lived around the same time as Crowley in Victorian England, I think had probably the best single definition of intuition that I've ever seen or read. And he was speaking as his character Sherlock Holmes, and he said, "Intuition is your accumulated life wisdom distilled in an instant." And I thought that was a really fascinating way of looking at it. It's just the idea that, I have enough experience that I kind of know what to do and know what I'm dealing with without having to do the math, without having to go through all the different steps of figuring it out. And I thought that that's really true. And I think that many people sort of want to sort of separate the mind. So there's the psychic mind, there's the rational mind, when in fact the mind is the mind, and both parts of it function simultaneously. And I think they both feed into each other. So I think that you can't only live in half your mind at the time. It has to all be working together. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, don't realize that.
I think that's really true, and I think that intuition gets underrated. And a lot of times you can have intuition as a reader first, and then you can build on it, because all that experience, like Michael said, really helps to fine tune the understanding of the cards or whatever tool
Right.
that you're using, astrology and things like that. But I remember reading that saying, "Oh, that's interesting. I would have thought, clairvoyance is more accurate." That was years ago. I read that. I believe it was Alice Bailey. Are there any other things that you found striking in the book that you wanted to mention?
Oh gosh. Um, you know, I thought it was really interesting in the here in the introduction where he says wherever sympathetic magic occurs in its pure unadulterated form, it is assumed that in nature one event follows another necessarily and invariably without intervention of any spiritual or personal agency. And I think that that's a very interesting quote, um, because he's talking about, I think, this idea of that, you're making something happen. And that if you make one thing happen, you're going to be able to control everything. So let's say that you did successfully use magic or intention in your life. And then you can kind of feel like, well, I can now manipulate everything, going forward. And it's about the moment, I think, and about trusting yourself and your intuition, knowing that it's going to serve you when it's supposed to. So I think that that's very interesting. I mean, you could kind of go on and on about Crowley, and you could take one of his quotes and kind of talk about it for an hour, you know.
It's true, and I'm always excited when I read that book. I really get more excited about Magick. He's such a big thinker, and he is also funny, like I said earlier. I also this time I was reading about the magical memory, and I don't remember reading about it before. Maybe I just don't remember. And I think I have a new, like, maybe interest in my past lives, because he
Mm.
believes the magical memory is about remembering your incarnations, your past incarnations. And he says the reason for that he is so that you can connect with your true will intelligently. So what you're doing, which my dad I think might have talked about on the past live show, is that you see these recurring themes, and so you can understand that this is not an arbitrary thing, that this is why I get gout. And he
Right.
says that, and that you have these same similar things that happen because you're working on a larger issue over many lives. So I thought, he says that's one of the most important things to do. And he says one way to do it, this one I don't know how you can do, is to make a vow that you're going to reincarnate quickly. I was like, okay, good luck with that with me.
Right.
But and then he says remembering things backwards. So you go back, and that makes sense to me. And it's a little harder than it looks to
Yeah,
try,
it is.
at the end of the day, to remember what you did that day, even
Well,
backwards.
and that was actually something that someone gave me as a tool, actually, um, was to go through your entire day backwards. And when you come across things you've said or done that you wish you hadn't, just say, "Oh, I'm not going to do that anymore." And you'd be surprised at how hard it is to go backwards and to do that. Because there's just so much, we travel so much within the day of the maze of the complexity of all of our thoughts and everything that we're doing. And I often think we block things out that we don't necessarily like, or things that we like that we maybe aren't ready to see.
Crowley would absolutely agree with you on that, because the thing we really block out is death. And he said that that's one of the obstacles, that you have to go back through the death that you had, like in the previous incarnation. And this is the book, by the way, or this is one area you can see why he claims he was the reincarnation of Eliphas Levi. He has some really unusual specific things, because he talks about it not being a vanity thing, like, I was Shakespeare or Cleopatra. Mary Magdalene was really popular for a while there.
Right.
But that it's just to help you to see your themes. And so he goes through and talks about, I recommend you reading this, the specific ways that are really unusual that he could have been Levi. One was he was close, their death was, Levi's close to his birth, 6 months close to Aleister Crowley's birth. But he had a couple of books and formulas that he thought were his own Crowley, and he came across it with Levi, and they were exactly Levi's work. They also had, he said he actually resembled his father. Levi actually looked like who was a religious man. And so it's not arbitrary. And then he says, when you're remembering past lives, he says, what's interesting, you remember weird things, like things that are trivial to other people, but they were important to you.
Right.
And they're not necessarily all of the written history of that person. You might not even remember that.
Right.
But you get a sense that there's something, genuine, authentic about the memory. That's one way you can tell it's a past life. And I said, that totally makes sense to me, because even if you think in this life, I remember some of the strangest little things, good and bad, that really aren't relevant to other people, but they are to my soul.
Right. I mean, it's sort of like my obsession with the Holocaust. You know what I mean? As from like a young age. Now that I'm older and I've been exploring all these things, it's like, yeah, it's probably some sort of past life memory for sure, whether it was actually being in the Holocaust or, I'm Polish. My father's whole side is Poland. And I actually was having a huge conversation last week with a friend that, in World War II, Poland was just eviscerated. I mean, the Poles were just considered slaves. I mean, and so I'm sure, like, in my DNA, there has to be these memories. And it's very meaningful to me, but to go talking about something like that, like I'm in high school reading Eli Elie Wiesel's Night, and I think it's just so fascinating, and people are like, what are you reading that depressing book for? You know what I mean? It's like, I think it's awesome. I'm reading it 5 times. Could you imagine? So Schindler's List like 8 times. I kid you not. My brother and I saw it in the movie theater like 3 times, and I was in England, and I caught it as that. I mean, who watches that movie 4 times? I mean, like, if you to see it once, So I think it's important to actually listen to these, and when you get these things, to listen to them, and it's a part of who you are. That our past lives are integrated into our present lives,
Right?
And it's, I think, moving forward, if we are to incarnate again, there are certain things we're supposed to be learning and letting go of. So we're not supposed to be taking everything into every life. I do think we're supposed to be learning and not going over the same things over and over and over again. And the whole point is that, to reach that point where you're no longer going into another life.
Right, you're free from the wheel.
They're free from the wheel of it, exactly. And then you're reaching nirvana, or whatever you might want to call it, depending on what you study. But absolutely.
He also said something interesting. Again, this is his theory, that it's not conclusive. He said that against a previous incarnation, if the present one is inferior to the past.
Right.
And he says one reason is that you kind of divvy up karma sometimes in different lives. Maybe you want to have a whole bunch of karma swept up in one life, so it's a really difficult incarnation just to get it out of the way. And he said he had some of those horrible lives. I said, well, that is an interesting theory, that, maybe there is a little more. It's not like each life you appear to advance.
Right.
Because you're trying to get rid of some of the things that you didn't have time to in another lifetime.
It actually makes complete sense, because some people just seem to have the worst. I mean, like everything whereas other people that don't even try, and they don't even seem really, I don't know, worthy of it, just seem to have everything so easy. And it's like, well, maybe I'm burning some karma so that, in the next life, it's, I don't know, I'm going to end up being an Arabian prince or something like that. Or even just, you're burning off karma early on in life so that in the second half of your life, maybe you have a lot of more abundance. It's very interesting. That seems to be it.
Yes, and please remember to subscribe to our channel, like us, comment, especially like us, you guys, because I know some of you are liking me on Instagram or us on Instagram, but please also do it under the video. Check out this month's forecast, The Cosmic Weather with Olivia, our new co-host for that show. It's out, it's for June. And we will see you next week as we continue to explore the esoteric and obscure.
Yeah. Magic is spontaneous. It wouldn't be magical if it happened all the time.
Have a great week.
Bye, guys.